It seemed the couple was meant to be.
There was a pool of blood.
I didn't know if he was still alive.
She was hysterical, screaming.
But just when detectives think the case is closed, a killer strikes again.
In 1998, Nena Bolton shot and killed her husband in McNeil, Arkansas. She said she was the victim. She served 5 years and came home. 8 years later, she planned a second killing. The man who had defended her paid her bills and never doubted her. He was beaten and stabbed inside his own home while she was out getting ice cream. 2 murders, 1 woman, and a trail of people who would eventually tell investigators everything. This is that story. To understand how it came to this, we begin in McNeil, Arkansas, 1998, with a gunshot and a story that would take 8 more years to fall apart. Larry Bolton's truck rolled into McNeil just after 8 in the morning, the engine ticking in the September heat, the town looking exactly the way it always had, small, still, and waiting. The road into town was flat and familiar. Scrub pine ran along both shoulders, and the sky had already gone the pale white of an Arkansas September that has no intention of cooling down. Larry had driven this stretch of blacktop more times than he could count. He knew every dip in the road, every gap in the tree line where the land opened into field. The truck moved through it all the way a man moves through his own house in the dark without thinking, without hesitating, by pure and trusted memory. He was 48 years old. For most of his working life, he had worn a badge for Columbia County, driving these same roads as a sheriff's deputy, learning the county the way law enforcement learns a place by what happens where and to whom. He had retired from that work and moved to the water department. Steadier hours, less weight. He had believed in quiet lives. He had believed, more broadly, that the systems he spent decades serving would hold around him the way they held around everyone else. He was going back to the trailer. 3 months earlier, he had left the way a man leaves when he wants nothing except out. He had taken $750, his truck, and the camper. He left a letter. He had not asked for anything he did not need, and he had not looked back. He had called his brother Terry that morning, before he drove out. Terry was a sheriff's deputy, same county, same roads, same understanding of how things worked. Larry told him not to worry. He said he would be fine. He said it the way men say things they believe entirely, with no particular reason to think the belief will ever be tested. Hold that. Not the words, the certainty. A man who had spent a career reading rooms and reading people, who knew from experience that danger announces itself in patterns. He saw no pattern that morning. He saw a familiar road and a piece of paper waiting to be signed. The truck slowed as the trailer came into view. It sat in the yard exactly as he had left it, low against the flat ground, quiet in the full morning light. A car was parked near the side. The grass needed cutting. Nothing about the yard said anything at all. This was September in a small town in Columbia County, Arkansas, and it looked like exactly that. He cut the engine. The ticking stopped. In the silence, the cicadas came back loud, steady, indifferent to whatever came next. He reached for the door handle. The metal was already hot from the morning sun. He had told his brother he would be fine. He was wrong. 5 years before Larry Bolton drove back to McNeil, his wife had already shown the county who she was. It was 1993. Nena Bolton, Larry's wife, a woman whom people in Columbia County described as charming, as warm, as someone you trusted before you thought to question why, filed an assault complaint against a fellow deputy at the local sheriff's department. The department investigated. They found no basis for the claim. The matter was officially closed. That should have been where it ended. It was not. Before the day was out, Nena went to her husband's car and took the revolver she found there. Then she walked back toward the sheriff's office with the weapon in her hand. Terry Bolton was there when she arrived. He saw the door come open. He saw the gun. He watched the room respond, the fast, quiet movement of trained people who understand what a firearm in an unsteady hand can do in a small space. He would remember the way she stood in that doorway, the way she looked at the room as if she were calculating what it would do. The revolver was taken from her. She was not arrested. The complaint, the gun, the whole morning, it all went into a file, and the file went into a drawer, and the drawer was closed. Nobody in that room understood what they had witnessed. She had filed a claim with no foundation. She had escalated to a weapon when the claim failed. Then she had stopped and let the system absorb it and walked out. That is not how a person behaves when they are frightened. That is how a person behaves when they are measuring what a system will quietly swallow. Did anyone ask in 1993 what she was measuring for? The years moved on. The file sat in its drawer. By the summer of 1998, Larry had been gone from the trailer for 3 months, gone the way a man goes when he wants nothing except out. Nena called him in September. She told him his things were packed and ready. She said to come and get them. He came back that afternoon with paperwork. He was not afraid. He had spent his working life enforcing order, and he trusted the way such men do, that the order held. He knew the trailer the way a person knows a place they have lived in for years, the sounds it made in the afternoon heat, the way the light moved across the rooms toward evening. He had no reason to feel anything except finished. He did not know about the 1993 file. He did not know that the woman inside had once stood in a doorway with his own gun, and a story already built for whoever came to ask. He stepped through the door and into the afternoon quiet. He walked back into the trailer he had fled, and this time he would not walk back out. The 911 console at the McNeil dispatch center lit up at 2:47 in the afternoon. Artie Talley reached for the handset before the second tone finished. The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm for what it was saying. "My husband's been shot." Artie Talley had taken hundreds of calls. Accidents, domestics, kids who dialed by mistake. She knew what panic sounded like, and she knew what it didn't sound like. She logged the address on County Road 9 and sent the first unit before Nena Bolton had finished the sentence. The call lasted 89 seconds. Nena did not cry during any of them. 3 miles away, Josh Bolton was cleaning his gear in the equipment room of the Columbia County Sheriff's Department. He was 22 years old and not yet sworn, still learning the gap between what the manual said and what happened in the field. He had grown up around lawmen. He understood the job the way you understand something that's lived inside your house before you've chosen it yourself. He had chosen it anyway. His uncle Larry had never carried a badge, but Larry had always respected the people who did, and that had meant something to Josh. The radio crackle reached him before the formal notification did. County Road 9, male subject, gunshot wound, not breathing. Josh heard the address. He heard it again. The way your brain replays something it isn't ready to process. He knew that road. He had driven it his whole life. He knew the trailer at the end of it, the creak of the front steps, the smell of the kitchen, the table where Larry used to pour coffee and tell the same 3 stories in rotation. Larry had taught him to change a tire in the gravel out front. He set down what he was holding. Procedure said he should wait. He was a cadet. He had no legal authority at a crime scene. Every hour of training pointed to the same instruction: wait. He did not wait. What no one had told Josh yet, what was sitting in the dispatch notes, not yet passed to a supervisor, was that the woman who had made the call was still at the scene. Standing. Not crying, not pacing, just standing at the door of the trailer in the September afternoon. Artie Talley had flagged it on the tape log, without quite knowing what to call it. The voice had been flat, measured, every word placed exactly where it needed to go. That detail would matter later. It did not reach Josh in time. He walked into the corridor. A deputy near the front desk had the radio in hand. Josh did not ask if he could go to County Road 9. He told the deputy he was going. The deputy looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that calculates what an argument will cost, and then nodded once. Josh hollowed down the hall. It was the last time anything felt like procedure. Josh arrived before anyone thought to stop him. The drive took less than 10 minutes. Nothing outside the trailer looked different from any other afternoon on County Road 9, the pines, the gravel, the quiet. The hallway was narrow, and the blood had already begun to dry at the edges. Larry Bolton lay face down on the trailer floor in the hallway. He had been shot in the right temple. He had not moved from where he fell. The space around him was tight. A man his size barely fit the width of that corridor. The blood had pooled beneath him. At the edges, where it had spread the farthest and thinned the most, it had already started to darken and crust. Artie Talley came through the door with the first unit. Glenn Sly, the investigator assigned to process the scene, moved through the trailer behind her. The revolver was still in the hallway. It had not been moved. A .22 lying near the body, the way a thing lies when someone has set it down rather than dropped it. That detail would matter. The scene was not large. A man dead in his own home, a weapon present, no ransacking, no forced entry, no evidence of a struggle that had moved between rooms. The trailer had told them almost everything except who had been holding the gun. What was also there, Nena Bolton, outside on the steps when the first units arrived, still quiet in the way that does not match what has just happened inside. And there was Robbie McCallie. Robbie was 18 years old, and he was in the yard when law enforcement pulled up. He did not run. He did not fall apart. He stood and watched them process the property. When Glenn Sly moved toward him, the question was still forming. Robbie spoke first. He handed over the .22 without being asked. Then he said it, flat, without apology. The way someone says a thing they have carried long enough that it no longer feels like a confession, it feels like a fact. "I'm glad the son of a bitch is dead." Glenn Sly wrote it down. The statement went into the official record exactly as spoken. Investigators noted it, logged it, and began building a theory around it. A teenage boy, a dead man, a weapon surrendered by hand, a motive named out loud. In 8 words, Robbie McCallie had handed them what looked like a case. It sounded like one. That was the problem, because Robbie McCallie said he was glad. And for the next several weeks, the investigation would belong to him, not because the evidence demanded it, but because someone needed it to. And that someone was still on the steps, watching the machinery turn in exactly the direction she had pointed it. The weeks after September 15 belonged to Robbie McCallie the way a decoy belongs to whoever set it. Investigators worked the case in his direction. Nena went home and let them. In McNeil, who you were before the crime determined whether anyone believed you after it. This was a small town built on generational memory. Families did not move often. Names accumulated history the way furniture accumulates dust, slowly, invisibly, until the weight of it was everywhere. The people who walked into September 1998 had been walking toward it for a long time. Nena had not held steady work across her adult life. She had been married more than once before Larry. Each time, the financial architecture of her life had required someone else to carry the weight, and she had understood, the way some people understand early, how to stay close to whoever that would be. In McNeil, that person had a specific name. Ralph Ward was 83 years old. He had served as mayor of McNeil for 38 years. That kind of tenure doesn't happen by accident. It requires a man to become over decades the town itself. He was Nena's grandfather. He had loved her without condition since she was a child. That love had expressed itself in practical terms: financial support when she needed it, social standing by association, the benefit of the doubt in a community that might otherwise have withheld it. In a town where Ward had served as the institutional face of authority for nearly 4 decades. Nena's proximity to his name had always functioned as a kind of protective field. Whoever questioned Nena was, by extension, questioning Ralph Ward. Most people in McNeil had never done that, and September 1998 gave them no particular reason to start. Nena had never needed to be dangerous. She had always had someone else's name to stand behind. The name she stood behind was old and respected and believed. That mattered in McNeil in the fall of 1998. It mattered more than it should have. Larry had grown up in a law enforcement family in Columbia County. He understood the rules of his world, the legal ones and the personal ones. He had been married to his first wife, Mary Sue, for 18 years before Nena. When he remarried in 1992, His brother Terry had concerns he didn't fully voice until too late. Larry was a man who left a situation rather than escalate it. He had left the trailer when the marriage turned dangerous, taken what he could, put distance between himself and Nena. And then, in September 1998, he had gone back, concluding that the danger had passed, that something could be reclaimed. He was wrong. The record makes that plain. Investigators had a homicide, they had a trailer and a .22 revolver already in evidence. Only 2 people had been alive inside that trailer on September 15, 1998. One of them was dead. The question of who had been holding the gun had a limited number of answers. The question of who had been holding the gun had one answer that fit. Sly understood this before anyone else was willing to say it out loud. He pulled Robbie McCallie aside that same afternoon, and he had one question. "Tell me exactly what happened inside that trailer." Robbie told him. He spoke without hesitation and without color. He said he had been at the trailer when things went wrong between Larry and Nena. He said the 2 of them had been arguing about money, he said, about checks, about the same ground they had covered before. The argument had escalated. Through the wall of the trailer, Robbie said. He could hear Nena's voice, then Larry's, then Nena's again, going back and forth in the narrow space of that hallway. Then he heard Nena's voice change register. She said she'd write him another check if he'd stop hitting her, Robbie said. Sly wrote it down. There was a pause in the account, and in that pause, Robbie's eyes moved to a point somewhere to the left of Sly's shoulder. He was not looking at anything in particular. Then he said, "Then I heard the shot." He looked at Sly. Not through him, at him, the way someone looks when they expect to be believed. That was the statement. Flat, delivered without pause and without grief. Robbie had been close enough to hear the shot, close enough to hear the argument that preceded it, and his voice had not changed once from the beginning of the account to the end. Not a break, not a single wrong turn. Sly noted the silence that came after. Witnesses who had been through something real rarely moved through it without snagging on something, a correction, a hesitation, a detail they had to go back for. Robbie had not snagged once. When a man describes watching another man die, and his voice never changes, is that shock, or is that something else? He had an investigator's word for what he was seeing, not a clinical one. He wasn't there for clinical. The word was wrong. The careful sequence of events, the pacing between details, the way Robbie's account had arrived fully formed, with no gaps and no hesitation and no wrong turns. He wrote it all down, nothing disprovable yet, nothing that contradicted the physical evidence on record. Just the shape of a story that felt constructed rather than remembered. 2 days later, Nena gave her account. She had been inside the trailer, she said. There was an argument about money, about checks, about what was owed. Larry had become physical. She said she offered to write another check if he would stop. She heard a shot from the hallway. The accounts matched. Detail by detail, beat by beat. The version Robbie gave and the version Nena gave arrived at the same destination. That kind of alignment doesn't happen by accident. It can mean 2 people told the truth. It can mean something else. Her story matched everything Robbie said, everything except what her own body would later tell. By the time the sedation wore off, Nena Bolton had already begun to construct the version of events she intended to survive with. She was in a hospital in Magnolia, brought in after the shooting. The attending nurses came to check on her. She was awake, she was talking. The story arrived organized, sequential. Larry had attacked her inside the trailer, she told them. He had forced Prozac pills down her throat. She described the escalation, his hands, his voice, the position of his body, as things turned from words to something worse. Then she said he had been moving toward the kitchen. He was going to the kitchen for a knife. I had no choice. The nurses wrote it down. The account reached them without gaps, without corrections, without the hesitations that come when someone is pulling a memory out of genuine shock. Each detail arrived in order. Each detail led cleanly to the next. It was the same story Robbie had given at the trailer. The same argument, the same sequence, the same kitchen, the same knife, the same conclusion. 2 people had given investigators 2 accounts, and the accounts were identical in everything that could be verified. The investigation was still treating this as corroboration. Nena's account was also specific in ways that a self-defense narrative needed to be. She named the medication Prozac. She placed Larry's body moving toward a room and a weapon. She gave the story a geometry where people stood, what was said, what happened in sequence and why. Before any investigator had walked into that hospital room to ask her a formal question, the account complete. The nurse's documentation of Nena's account would become part of the official record. It sat alongside the notes from the trailer and the notes from Sly's interview with Robbie, three separate documents that told the same story. Not one inconsistency between them. She had been attacked, she said. Her skin said otherwise. The investigators who came to document Nena's injuries arrived at the hospital prepared to record what a physical assault leaves behind. The documentation would have been straightforward. A man's hands on a woman's face and arms produce marks. Pressure against skin produces bruising. A struggle the kind Nena had described in precise detail leaves evidence that cannot be staged or delayed. It either happened or it did not. They examined her face. They examined her arms. The absence was not subtle. Not faint bruising that hadn't fully formed, nothing like that. It was simply the absence of anything. No marks on her face. No bruising on her forearms or wrists, nothing consistent with the physical confrontation she had described to the nurses in sequential, practiced detail. Larry, according to Nena's account, had put his hands on her. Not one mark showed it. Investigators paid close attention to her face and arms, looking for what her story required to be there. There was nothing there. No bruising, no marks. Nothing that a man's hands leave behind. The forensic finding had answered what Nena's body could not deny. What it couldn't answer was the question Terry Bolton had been sitting with for months. Not whether something was wrong in that trailer, but how long it had been wrong. Terry Bolton had been waiting for someone to ask him the right question, and when Glenn Sly finally did, he had more than an answer. He had a history. He told Sly about Larry's fear, not vague unease, not the ordinary friction of a troubled marriage, but specific, documented fear. Larry had taken guns from Nena. Not once, on multiple occasions. Across the time they had been together, he had found weapons and removed them from her reach before she could use them. He had done this quietly, without filing reports, without bringing it to anyone official. He had handled it the way men of his generation sometimes handled things, by managing the danger himself, on the assumption that managing it was enough. It was not enough. He told me he was tired of sleeping with one eye open, Terry said. Sly wrote it down. The statement landed differently than it would have a week earlier, before the forensic examination. Before the absence on Nena's face and arms had confirmed what her account required and her body could not produce. Now Terry's words fit inside a picture that had been resolving the 911 call. The revolver placed in the hallway, the matching accounts, the unmarked skin. Terry had a name for what had been happening inside that marriage. He had had it for a long time. This was not a marriage that turned dangerous. This was a marriage that had always been dangerous, and one man had known it for years. Terry walked Sly back to 1993. The outline of what had happened that year was already in the record. The false assault claim, the revolver Nena had taken from Larry's car, the day she walked into the sheriff's office with it. What Terry added was the context the official record had never captured. Nena had survived that incident because of who she was in McNeil, because of whose name she carried. The incident had been documented and then absorbed. The way things get absorbed in a small town when the person at the center of them is connected to someone important. Ralph Ward's granddaughter. The pattern was not new. It was simply old enough that it had never been treated as a pattern. A single incident is an incident. A second incident is a coincidence. What Sly received in that room was a third column, the through line from 1993 to the afternoon of September 15, 1998, when Larry had walked back into the trailer he had left and not walked back out. Sly had a forensic finding that said the attack didn't happen the way Nena claimed. He had a witness who said the danger had been real and documented and known. The two findings were pointing in the same direction. One test had answered one question. It had not touched the one that mattered. The gunshot residue result came back, and it said what Glenn Sly had begun to suspect it would say. Negative. 6 weeks after Larry Bolton's body had been removed from the hallway of that trailer on McNeil Road, the Arkansas State Crime Lab returned its findings on Robbie McCallie. The test was designed to detect the microscopic particles that a discharged firearm leaves on the hands of whoever fired it. On Robbie McCallie's hands, there was nothing. No barium, no antimony, no lead. The swabs taken at the scene had come back clean. The test had been requested to confirm a theory. It had instead demolished one. Robbie was 18 years old, living in the trailer with Nena and Larry, present at the moment of the shot, holding the .22 revolver when the first officer arrived. He had handed it over without being asked. He had said he was glad the son of a bitch was dead. He had described the argument over money, the offer of a check, and then the sound that ended it. He had said all of this without flinching, and that flatness had made investigators look at him hard. The lab said he had not fired the gun. The 6 weeks of building a case around one possibility had to be set aside. Robbie McCallie walked away from the investigation, not because his story was believed, but because the evidence said he had not pulled the trigger. There is a difference. Lai understood the difference. Robbie McCallie had not fired that gun, which meant someone else had. There were 2 other people inside that trailer when Larry Bolton was shot. One of them was Larry, the other was Nena. Sly returned to what the evidence had already assembled. Nena's hospital account, sequential, gap-free, delivered to nurses before investigators arrived, described a woman who had fired in self-defense. Her skin had described nothing of the kind. No bruising, no marks, no injuries consistent with the assault she had named as the reason she pulled the trigger. Terry Bolton's account described a man who had spent years removing a loaded weapon from his wife's reach. The 1993 incident at the sheriff's office had put Nena's pattern into the record long before September 15, 1998. Forensic absence, a cleared suspect, a witness account that ran in the opposite direction from Nena's story, a woman with no injuries who said she had been attacked. There was one test that had not been done. Nena Bolton's hands had not been swabbed for gunshot residue at the scene. The window for that test had closed. Whatever the swabs might have said, they would never be asked to say it now. And Larry Bolton's body, still in evidence, had not yet been asked everything it knew. One answer. One question still untouched, and a body that had not lied yet. The medical exam report landed on Glenn Sly's desk, and it said, in clinical language, exactly nothing that Nena Bolton's story required it to say. The examining physician at Magnolia Regional Hospital had documented Nena's condition on the night of September 15th and through the morning of September 16th. The report ran to several pages. What it did not contain was any of the injuries Nena had described. No bruising on her face, no marks on her neck, no contusions on her arms consistent with a man holding her down. The column where documented injuries should have appeared was empty. She had told hospital nurses that Larry forced Prozac into her, that he held her and made her swallow it. The toxicology screen addressed that claim directly. The only medication present in her system was the mild sedative administered by hospital staff after her admission. No Prozac, no external compounds at all. Whatever had been swallowed in that trailer. The chemistry had left no record because there was nothing to leave a record of. The story required a beaten woman. The body produced none. Nena had described forced medication. The blood said otherwise. Sly read the report the way an investigator reads something that confirms what he already suspected, carefully, looking for the place where it might say something different. It did not say something different. A story with no body behind it is not a defense. It is a script. He had been reading the script for 6 weeks. Robbie McCallie's version of it matched Nena's so closely that both of them had to have come from the same source. The hospital nurses described how she delivered it sequentially, unhesitating, gap-free. Terry Bolton described a woman who had been performing danger for years, always with a man nearby to absorb the weight of that performance. In 1993, Nena walked into a sheriff's office with Larry's revolver and a story about her own fear. The story was enough. No one looked for injuries. No one ran a toxicology screen. She walked away because the performance was sufficient for the room she was performing in. The audience was different now. The 1998 account had the same architecture as the one from 1993. A threatening man, a woman with no choice, an act of self-preservation. In 1993, the evidence was never tested. In 1998, the tests came back one after another, and each one said the same thing. No body behind the story, no bruising. No foreign compounds, no gunshot residue on the hands of anyone but the person the account was built to protect. The medical report joined the other documents on his desk. Forensic absence, a cleared suspect, a witness account pointing in the wrong direction. A pattern going back 5 years. The story that was supposed to save her was the same one she had rehearsed before, and this time, someone was checking. Larry Bolton had left as quietly as a man could leave, and that quietness was the first thing investigators used to prove the killing was planned. Glenn Sly worked backward through the last 3 months of Larry's life. The shape of the departure was not complicated. In June 1998, Larry left the trailer. He took $750, his truck, and his camper. He left everything else where it was, the furniture, the fixtures, the accumulated weight of the marriage. He left a letter. The letter was not angry. It did not list grievances or make demands. It read the way a man writes when he has decided the only thing he wants is distance and has chosen to leave without a fight. Investigators read it the way evidence gets read when a man is dead and can no longer speak for himself, as proof of character. A man who left quietly had no plans to return with violence. He also believed, clearly, that going quietly would keep him safe. The letter documented the first truth. It could not provide the second. Terry Bolton had known better than to be fully reassured. He had watched his brother sleep with one eye open for years. He had been the one person Larry talked to honestly that he was tired, that he was going, that he would be fine. He had wanted to believe it. The letter gave him a reason to try. What Sly established next turned the case. The investigation documented Larry's reason for returning on September 15th. He had not gone back to argue or to retrieve anything Nena would have needed to withhold. He had gone back for a paycheck he was owed, and for the divorce papers that would end the marriage on paper. 2 specific things. A man settling his last business on the way out the door. What kind of woman packs a man's belongings and calls him home to collect them? Nena had told Larry his things were packed and waiting. Come and get them. It was a practical message, the kind a reasonable person sends. It created a known date, a named purpose, a specific errand. He would arrive expecting boxes and a signature, not a confrontation. A man expected at a door that would be opened for him. Sly documented the sequence. Larry had told Terry he planned to go. The papers were in place. Everything about the visit had the shape of ordinary closure, the last things
And he said, I'll be okay.
the middle of a divorce would expect to be dangerous. And that, in a homicide investigation, is the detail that demands attention. An arrangement that looks routine from the outside sometimes looks very different once you establish who designed it. Nena had set the date. She had sent the invitation. She had arranged the conditions of his arrival. He came back for a piece of paper. He did not know the door was already closing behind him. Nena Bolton walked out of Magnolia Regional Hospital and into handcuffs within 24 hours of the shot that killed Larry Bolton. The medical exam had answered the last open question. No injuries, no forced medication. A self-defense account with nothing physical to confirm it, and a cleared suspect who, by the evidence, had not fired the weapon. The investigation had what it needed. The charge filed was first-degree murder. The handcuffs were the first concrete consequence Nena had faced for anything. In 1993, she had walked into a sheriff's office carrying Larry's revolver and walked back out the same day. The law had touched her and let go. 5 years later, it was not letting go. The self-defense story she had delivered to the nurses, then to investigators. Then, to anyone positioned to receive it, it was now the official defense of a woman under arrest for murder. She would have to make it hold in a courtroom, against evidence that had already refused to confirm it. Before a jury that had not yet seen any of the documents Sly had assembled. The charge was first-degree murder. Not a domestic accident, not an act of self-preservation the law had been persuaded to overlook. A premeditated killing. Sly had assembled what the evidence built. The forensic absence, the cleared co-suspect, the accounts that matched each other and contradicted the physical record. The letter Larry had left 3 months before, a man who had wanted only distance. The invitation Nena had extended to call him back to the trailer. Every piece pointed the same way. None of it pointed towards self-defense. Remember his name, Ralph Ward. He will come back. Before we hear what he did next, drop a comment and tell us where you're listening from. This case started in one small county in Arkansas. It reached further than that. Note some scenes ahead include recreated details for narrative purposes. The facts are real. Ralph Ward did not wait to hear what Sly had assembled. He did not ask to see the medical report, or the toxicology results, or the forensic findings, or the reasons investigators had moved so quickly to a first-degree charge. He heard that his granddaughter was under arrest for murder, and he reached for the phone. He had been McNeil's mayor. He had built his name into every corner of that county. He had believed the story she told in 1993. He had believed everything she told him since. That record of believing was unbroken. He believed her now. He would fund the defense, no hesitation, no doubt, no question. The accumulated evidence might have answered for him if he had thought to ask. He was the most loyal person in Nena Bolton's life. He would remain so for 8 more years. Ralph Ward, who had always believed her, was already on the phone with an attorney. A year into the proceedings, Nena Bolton's attorney stood up in court and changed her plea. The case had grown in the months between her arrest and trial. A second name had entered the charging documents, someone connected to the planning of Larry Bolton's death, who had not been in the trailer when the shot was fired. The conspiracy charge extended beyond Nena. But on the day her attorney addressed the bench, the story narrowed back to her. She had faced first-degree murder. The medical exam had said what it said. The forensics had said what they said. The cleared co-suspects' results were in the record. A jury would have heard all of it, the matched accounts, the forensic absences, the pattern going back to 1993, and they would have heard the self-defense story tested against every piece of evidence that refused to confirm it. Her attorney changed the plea to second-degree murder. The courtroom had assembled a particular kind of quiet. What had begun as a first-degree murder case became, with a few words from her attorney, a matter of paperwork. The prosecution's evidence, the forensic record, the cleared co-suspect, the evidence assembled across the investigation, was never laid before 12 people. Her attorney made sure of that. The self-defense account Nena had given at the hospital, through the months of pre-trial proceedings, was never tested in open court. It was not argued, not cross-examined, not submitted to a jury. It was abandoned, set aside, discarded at the plea table without ceremony or explanation. The story that had been her only line of defense from the moment the first officer arrived did not survive contact with a trial date. The sentence was 20 years. 20 years. She would serve 5. The judge entered the sentence into the record. The gavel came down. A number like that, spoken aloud in a courtroom, carries a particular weight long enough, when it is written down, to feel like it holds, like something that cannot be shortened by procedure. What 20 years becomes depends on what the parole board decides the first time it meets. Nena appeared before the board for the first time 5 years into her sentence. The board considered what the record showed. She walked out. Ralph Ward had waited. He had continued. In the years she was imprisoned, to hold the account she had given from her hospital bed in 1998, the version of events that her own guilty plea had quietly invalidated. When the granddaughter he had always protected came home, he was there. The official record showed a resolution, a guilty plea, 2 decades on paper. The Bolton family could read the record. The family could also count. She made parole at her first board meeting. 5 years. That was all it cost. Nena Bolton came home to McNeil in September 2004 and moved into a mobile home on the property of the man who had paid for her defense. The arrangement required almost no adjustment. Ralph Ward had covered Nena's costs long before the murder charge landed, covered her legal costs through the proceedings, and continued supporting her through 5 years of incarceration. What she returned to in 2004 was a version of what she had left: a roof on his land, bills that were his responsibility, her needs attended to by the same man who had always attended to them. She had served her time. She was home. And Ward had not changed his position by a degree. The mobile home sat on his property. The geography made visible what the relationship had always been. Nena proximate to a man with resources, and that man convinced she deserved them. McNeil was a small county. People remembered her name. They watched her return, settle in, and resume without apparent interruption. In the months that followed her return, a second person arrived on Ralph Ward's land. Shaunte Smith, known as Moochie, was the man who had been charged alongside Nena as a co-conspirator in the 1998 killing of Larry Bolton. He had been 27 years old when Larry died in that trailer. He had since served his sentence as a convicted felon. He moved into a property adjacent to Nena's on Ward's land. The man Ralph Ward was now watching with suspicion was the same man who had helped kill Larry Bolton. Ralph did not know that. Nena knew it precisely. What does a woman do when the man who has always paid for everything finally stops? A relationship developed between Nena and Moochie, the kind Ward did not approve of once he became aware of it. He told her to end it. She did not end it. He forbade the contact. She maintained it. The man who had believed every account she had ever given him was now standing in the way of something she had decided to have. He had covered her costs since before she could have managed them herself. The defense was funded, the housing was arranged, all of it without ever requiring the truth from her in exchange. When he discovered that Moochie Smith was living next door to his granddaughter and that the two were involved, he cut the money. It was the first time in Nena Bolton's life that the financial support she had depended on had been withdrawn without her asking for it. There had always been a man, a marriage, a grandfather, a family name positioned between her and the practical weight of her own choices. Ralph had cut the money. For the first time in her life, no one was going to take care of her, and she could not accept that. On the evening of June 15, 2006, Nena Bolton took her grandfather out for ice cream and water. The last ordinary thing she would ever do for him. Ward had survived Nena's first trial, survived her imprisonment, survived the years of watching her return and resume her life on his land. He had cut the money. He had stood between her and Moochie. He had set a boundary, for the first time, that he intended to hold. On the evening of June 15, his granddaughter came to the door and offered to take him out, and he accepted. The route was familiar. The purchase was small. Nena was attentive, the kind of attentive that does not call attention to itself. She got what he needed. She stayed close, kept the conversation ordinary, gave him no reason to look at the evening sideways. A man watching from the outside would have seen a granddaughter taking care of an old man, and that is what Nena needed anyone watching to see. Ralph had no reason to read anything different into the outing. He had known Nena his entire adult life. He had believed her in 1993, through the trial, and through the years after, without the evidence ever requiring him to. A man's belief held long enough becomes structural. It stops requiring new evidence. He saw his granddaughter. She had already been to his house. She had cut the screen herself. Before the outing began, before she arrived to collect him, Nena had gone to Ralph Ward's residence and cut the window screen, leaving an opening through which someone could enter and wait. By the time she pulled up to take him for ice cream, the preparation was complete. The outing was not a gesture of care, it was the duration of a plan. Moochie Smith was already inside the house. He had entered through the cut screen while Nena and Ralph were away from the property. The house was quiet from the outside. The car was gone. Anyone passing would have seen an ordinary evening residence at dusk, the kind of stillness that looks like an old man at rest. Inside, Moochie waited, the same man who had been standing in a trailer on a September afternoon when someone close to Nena Bolton last ended up dead. Nena drove Ralph home when the evening was done. She pulled up to the residence. She watched him gather himself and move toward the front door at the deliberate pace of an old man on a warm night. There was nothing to signal, nothing to say. The arrangement had been completed hours before she picked him up. He reached the door. She watched him open it. She watched him walk through. Someone was already waiting on the other side. The door to Ralph Ward's home was cracked open, and the family member who pushed it wider found blood. Ward was in his chair. He had not made it past the room he had settled into on his way through the door. Nena had watched him walk through a few hours before. Moochie Smith had beaten him with an ashtray. He had been stabbed 4 times in the chest. The injuries were not consistent with a man who had fallen or been surprised by anything random. The violence had been specific and deliberate, and it had been waiting for him. Police arrived at the residence. The scene was processed. Ralph Ward was dead in his own home, the home on whose land Nena had been living since her return from prison. The home where the evening's last errand had delivered him. A crowd assembled outside in the dark, the way small counties gather when something has happened and the news moves ahead of any statement. Nena Bolton was in the crowd. She was cooperative. She was visibly grieving, shoulders down, face arranged for loss, the particular posture of a woman who has just received terrible news about the person she loved most. She sought out the investigators without being summoned. She did not wait to be approached. She told them what she knew. "I was the last one with him," she said. "I dropped him off myself." She volunteered it. No one had asked yet which person had been with Ralph Ward at the end of his evening. Nena provided the answer before the question was formed. She had done this before. Every word she was saying she had already said. In 1998, she had delivered her account to hospital nurses before investigators arrived to formalize it. She had positioned herself as the primary witness, the one whose version would frame what the investigation looked for first. 8 years later, standing outside a dead man's house in the dark, the structure was identical. She was inside the story before anyone could place her outside it. A woman who volunteers that she was the last person with the victim is a woman who has already decided what that means. She is positioning herself as a witness rather than a suspect, making her presence at the scene into evidence of her innocence rather than evidence that requires explanation. She is building her story from the outside in, the same way she always has. The investigators took down what she said. They did not yet know her name from a file. They did not yet know that this was not the first time a man close to Nena Bolton had been found dead on an evening she had arranged. The performance had worked once before. She was already running it again. The anonymous call came in the day after Ralph Ward's body was found, 2 names, no explanation, and a direction investigators did not expect the case to turn. The caller did not give their own name. They gave 2 others. The case had been open less than a day. Someone already knew enough to put investigators on the right 2 people, which meant the conspiracy had extended further than Moochie Smith had anticipated, and further than Nena Bolton had controlled. Glenn Sly brought in the women the tip had named. Natalie Hutchison, one of 2 people Moochie had contacted in the hours after Ralph Ward's death to dispose of evidence, arrived alongside Emily Vaughn, who had answered the same call and made the same drive. Both were brought into the sheriff's office within 24 hours of the murder. They were told, plainly, that they could be charged with Ralph Ward's killing. The case was being offered to them as a door they could either step through or stay behind.
I could hear the dispatcher say, "Nena, you need to calm down. You need to calm down."
They had a limited window to choose. The room had a particular quality, the kind of quiet that settles when 2 people both know something the investigator is still building toward. Both women had come in knowing what the other had done. Both understood what was on the table, a charge, a number of years, a choice they could not unmake. Emily Vaughn broke first. Natalie had not committed to a direction yet. Emily had. The investigator had given both women the same set of facts. One of them had decided, in that room, that the facts were no longer manageable from the outside. She started talking before they finished the question. She told them that Moochie called after the murder. He needed the clothes gone, the clothes he had been wearing when he entered Ralph Ward's house. She described the call, the urgency in his voice, the specific ask, the understanding that this was not a request she could decline. "He called us," she said. "He needed us to get rid of the clothes." She and Natalie had collected the bag. They drove to a county road near Lake Columbia. The bag went into the water. Both women knew what they had done with it. Only one of them, sitting in that room, was prepared to say so. Emily was prepared. She gave Sly the county road, the lake, the sequence of the night, the call, the bag, the drive, the water. His words Moochie delivered in that call after he left Ralph Ward's house were now inside the official record. She had told Sly everything. Moochie had trusted her to stay quiet. She had held that silence for less than 48 hours before it became evidence. They drove with us to where the bag went in, and then she told us everything Moochie had said. Shaunte Smith did not make investigators wait. He was in custody within hours of Emily Vaughn's confession, and by the time they sat across from him, the story was already moving. He broke before they had finished arranging their folders. He told them Nena came to him first, not the other way. She had approached him with the plan not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a proposal with terms already written. Ralph Ward had property. He had land. He had mineral rights that had been quietly accumulating value for decades. When he died, the woman on his deed would inherit all of it. She told Moochie what his cut would be. He said she sat across from him and laid it out. She came to me with it. She said she'd get the property, the land, everything. She said I'd get $1 million. Investigators wrote it down. He kept going. She had already been inside the house. She knew the layout of the back room, the windows, which screen could be reached from the side yard. She told him which one she would cut and when. He was not supposed to go in until she had Ward out of the building. The ice cream run was not spontaneous. It was a schedule. $1 million is a number. The window screen she cut with her own hands was a decision. She made the call to Emily Vaughn and Natalie Hutchison herself. Moochie told them. She knew who to bring in and what she needed them for, not to help with the killing, but to help with what came after. Clothing, weapons, transport to wherever things could disappear. She had assigned roles before anyone set foot on the property. He gave them the sequence. The screen was cut earlier that day. The outing was timed. He entered through the back while Nena was in the car with Ward getting ice cream. Ward came home and walked through his own front door into the room where Moochie was waiting. What happened after that, Moochie described in full. The ashtray, the positioning, the 4 stab wounds to the chest, the chair where they found him the next morning. When he finished, the investigators had a complete picture. They had Emily Vaughn's account from the aftermath and Moochie's account of the plan and the act. The two testimonies fit together at every joint. There was one more thing they wanted to see. They walked out of the room and crossed the parking lot to where Nena Bolton's car was sitting. She had not been arrested yet. Her car had not been searched yet. They had her name from 2 separate confessions, a timeline that placed her at the scene, and a pattern that reached back 8 years to a house in McNeil where another man had also died. He gave her up completely, every detail. And then they went to look in the trunk of her car. The trunk was open. The tool was there exactly where Moochie Smith said it would be, exactly what he said it was. Glenn Sly logged it. 1 item. A window-cutting tool recovered from Nena Bolton's car, sitting in the same trunk she had driven to the ice cream parlor and back the night Ralph Ward was killed. The physical object placed her hands at the entry point of the murder. It didn't need her fingerprints. It needed to exist. And it did. The case was already built. Moochie had described it. Emily Vaughn had traced the clothing to the water. Now the trunk confirmed the gap between planning and act had been crossed not by coincidence, not by accident, but by preparation. Physical evidence and testimonial evidence had arrived at the same address. Then, investigators heard from Tonya West. She was a jailhouse informant who had served time alongside Nena at the Arkansas Department of Corrections, and she had come forward with what Nena told her during those years inside. Nena had talked, not vaguely, specifically. She had laid out the shape of what she arranged the property, the man, the plan, the kind of detail that only travels in one direction from the person who did it. Nena had trusted the wrong person. Again, it was the second time she had given too much to someone who would eventually sit across from an investigator and repeat it back. The first time, it cost her 5 years. This time, the ledger was longer. The man who paid for her first defense was the last man she killed. Hold that. Ralph Ward had hired an attorney for Nena after she was charged with Larry Bolton's murder in 1998. He had believed her story then. He visited during her incarceration. When she was paroled, he gave her a place to live on his own property and covered her bills when she couldn't. He was the person who had chosen, again and again, to stand between Nena Bolton and the consequences she was walking toward. She inherited nothing. The estate didn't pass the way she planned. What she got instead was a second set of charges in the same county, the same state, involving the same pattern, and this time, 3 people were willing to testify about every piece of it. In April 2007, Nena Bolton entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder. She received 25 years. Moochie Smith was sentenced to 25 years for the murder and 20 years for the burglary. The 2 sentences would run concurrently. The courtroom in Columbia County looked the same as it had looked before. The same county, the same woman, a different dead man. The plea was entered without ceremony, the way it had been entered once before. No trial, no cross-examination, no explanation from Nena, who had said what she said in 1998 and never said it again. Nena Bolton, 25 years for first-degree murder. The reckoning had only just begun. McNeil kept going after the verdicts, the way small towns always do, quietly and without resolution. The courthouse closed, the parking lot emptied. The case was filed, and Columbia County carried what it knew into the years that followed. Robbie McCauley carried it too. He had no choice. In the years after both convictions, he gave an account of what it had cost him. He said he didn't have a mother, not because she was in prison, because he had never truly known who she was. The investigators who worked the case remembered those words long after the sentences were handed down. I don't have a mother. I never really did. He had been a child when Larry Bolton died. He had been a young man when she was arrested the first time, convicted, paroled, and sent back into the world. He watched her return to McNeil, back to the same county, the same land, and he watched it end the same way it had ended before. 2 men dead, 2 pleas, 1 woman walking into 2 separate courtrooms. The grief he described was not for the person he lost. It was for the person who was never there. That kind of mourning has no beginning. There is no day it starts. It simply reveals itself, the way a room reveals itself when someone finally turns on a light and what was always there is suddenly visible. He had carried it his whole life. He had simply not had a name for it. What was Ralph Ward thinking, sitting in that car, being driven by his granddaughter for ice cream and water on the last, ordinary evening of his life? He had put his name behind her after the first murder, hired the attorney he was completely, opened his property to her when she returned. He was Plater, covered her bills without question. He was the last person in McNeil who trusted her without reservation. And he trusted her on the evening of June 15, 2006, sitting beside her in the car, while the man she had recruited was already inside his house. He did not know what she had prepared. He walked through his own front door. That was the last thing he did. There are cases where the record closes every question. This is not one of them. The confessions were taken, the tool was logged, the pleas were entered. But what Ralph Ward felt in that car, whether something registered, whether the evening felt different, whether he noticed anything at all, that part belongs to him. It is not in the record. It never will be. 2 men, 2 murders, 8 years apart. the same small town, the same woman at the center of both. He had believed Nena Bolton through the first murder, through the trial, through the years she was away, through the day she came back. He was the last person who still believed her. The one person who always believed her was the last person she killed. 2 men lost their lives in McNeil, Arkansas, and neither one saw it coming. Larry Bolton did not. Ralph Ward did not. He had spent years believing in the person who would end his life. That kind of loyalty does
I was blown away. I didn't really know what to think.
sitting with. What do we owe the people who trust us completely? Ralph Ward gave everything he had, his money, his home, his belief, and it cost him everything. The Bolton family carried the weight of 2 losses, 8 years apart, in the same small town. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell us what stood out. Share this with someone who follows true crime. These cases deserve to be known. And if you are new here, subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Every case we cover is based on real events, and every name you heard today was a real person. A note before you go. This story is based on a documented real case. Some scenes were reconstructed for narrative purposes, but the names, the dates, and the facts
Rob said that he was glad that the son of a bitch was dead.
belong to real people and real families. We tell these stories with respect for everyone affected. Thank you for listening.
He claimed self-defense. He was shot in the back of the head. I don't consider that self-defense. I consider that an execution.